Hi, this is Marlene with Miami Ghost Chronicles, and I want to welcome you to another episode of Stories of the Supernatural. Wherever you find us, whether it's a video or podcast on your favorite platform, please like and subscribe to us so that you can get notification of when a new show is released. You can also find us on major social media platforms. If you go to miamighostchronicles.com, you can find links to the videos or MP3 files, which you can download and enjoy without commercial interruptions. If you're into classic horror, ghost, and adventure stories, I narrate Nightshade Diary, and you can find links at nightshadediary.com. If scary stories are your bag, and listening to encounters with cryptids, ghosts, dogman, and other weird creatures sends a shiver up your spine, then go to supernaturalstorytime.com for links to our weekly podcasts. Noteworthy news about the paranormal world, true crime, conspiracy stories, and anything that is just plain weird can be found at eerie.news or visit the Stranger Than Fiction Stories tab at miamighostchronicles.com. Please subscribe to my newsletter on Substack. Just go to mppellicer.com for a link. I want to thank you for being part of my audience, and I think you are all wonderful. Hi, how's everybody doing? Well, this week the show is going to be about the 70s, strange stories from the 70s, okay? And because there's certain things that those of us that were alive that long, that, or even not even, I guess, that the 70s are remembered for. There was Vietnam, there was in entertainment, Farrah Fawcett, The Godfather, Saturday Night Fever. These are like iconic pop culture things that when people think of the 70s, even if you weren't alive back then, these are the things that usually come to mind. But like in all things, there was also a lot of dark undercurrents. As a matter of fact, in the entertainment business, in the 70s was when they came out with The Exorcist and The Omen and Rosemary's Baby, which, by the way, especially The Exorcist, which, like, you had all these stories of people running into their churches asking to get, exorcised. Because, and, I've mentioned this before, prior to this, if you ever went to see any type of horror flick or anything, Hammer, at the end of the day, the good guys, as in the priest or Peter Cushing or whoever was there, was going to triumph over evil. Should the crucifix tore the drapes off the thing, I'm talking like as an example of vampire. Bottom line, good overcame evil. And then in the 70s, and I'm mentioning this as part of the dark undercurrent that I think started to work itself from the culture up through entertainment or vice versa, however you wanted to think about it, as in, like, evil triumphed, or evil was so powerful that it could kill people. And even at the end, there's never a satisfactory, like you would see in other films or other types of entertainment where absolutely evil was overcome. If you remember Rosemary's Baby, she had the devil's child. The Omen, same thing. I mean, they made sequels, as a matter of fact. And The Exorcist, really, in the end, you see even though supposedly Reagan is saved or exorcised, uh, the demon or whatever changes and now takes over the priest. In other words, there was always this thing where, the good guys, evil was dangerous and overcame everybody, and the good guys barely scraped by, and basically it diminished the powers of good, God, however you want to look at it. But anyway, that was just entertainment. However, there was also a lot of dark crimes being committed. There's always been dark crimes, don't get me wrong. There's always been dark, nefarious crimes, you know, and there was a couple of them which reflected there with, again, there was, I want to say, in the 70s, this, I don't know what, how, what came first, the chicken or the egg? As far as this, how can I say it? This fascination with either dark rituals and in some cases Satanism or anything like that. And by the way, I'm not saying that all these things didn't exist way before, but for some reason it gained prominence during the 70s, if you want to think of it as a counter-revolution, whatever. But I'm going to bring to you today two cases from that time period, which some say are solved, but really I think that in a lot of cases, especially back then, law enforcement didn't want any loose ends. They wanted to tie it up, and if they found somebody that they could, come and bring to, bring to trial and convict them, and et cetera, then that's it. We got our guy or guys or whatever. No more, nothing else to see here. Could there have been other people? Yeah. Could there have been another? No, 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 no. It's done. It's a done deal. And you'll see what I mean. All right. Let's go on to the first story that we're talking about. And for those of you that are watching the video, you're going to see I'm going ahead and showing these different slides. And as I read along, you'll see that some of them pertain to what I'm talking about here. The first one is titled "Dark Deeds in Westchester County." All right, now in the early 70s, violent crimes that appeared separate and distinct from other events in hindsight seemed to have a dark thread binding them together. And you're going to find that this is when they were actually happening, whether the authorities or the police didn't want to see what was in front of them, or because later as the years go by, you can look back and say, wait a minute, all these crimes or these murders or whatever, there was a common denominator there. But back then, unfortunately, they were treated separately. Anyway, in 1972, John Godwin wrote a book titled Occult America. For his research, he went to San Francisco and interviewed Anton LaVey. This is the Anton LaVey that appeared in Rosemary's Baby, that was photographed with Jane Mansfield before she got killed in her car accident. That Anton LaVey. Then he came across a group known as the Asmodeus Society, named after one of the 7 princes of hell. He represents lust, and his enemy is the Archangel Gabriel. They were a satanic cult with an Afro-Caribbean influence. Their members were barred from speaking Satan's sacred name. Godwin described attending a meeting held at the upscale home of a dental surgeon in Westchester County, New York. The high priestess for the night was 21 years old and named Judy. She made a living as a commercial artist. 11 members participated in crazed rituals which ended when a nude black woman prostrated herself on top of a Brazilian flag spread out on the floor. A hairy, naked man with a large belly came in wearing a horned goat's head inside a small coffin-like white box. He pulled out a chicken, which he decapitated with a razor, as a tape played Haitian music punctuated with the sound of voodoo rattles. The blood was spattered over the woman. The other members, 3 who were black, who observed the ritual, came forward to smear the blood over the woman and themselves. As far as he could tell, they seemed to be high on something. He suspected it was probably DMT or hashish, but not liquor. Not long after the ritual ended when the woman on the floor left. Now, remember, and this is the thing that a lot of times people that participate in these rituals or are part of either we want to call them a cult or what is it? Like Clark Kent, reporter by day, Superman by whatever. These people sometimes hold down very ordinary type jobs. And you look at them and you would never tell that they participate in some of these things. And as far as the Brazilian flag and the Haitian music, all of these are all of these countries have some type of Afro influence from the diaspora of the slaves, where they basically made their own religion. A lot of it, which does involve animal sacrifice, and on occasion human, even though a lot of people will deny it. But anyway, this gentleman, Mr. John Godwin, later he learns that the woman on the flag belonged to the cast of a current Broadway musical. See what I mean? Even after the arrest of Berkowitz, questions lingered about other crimes in Westchester County, and this is what we're talking about here. This is he goes and he's doing his research, and he sees this in 1972. Fast forward to 1976, Westchester County, and it's plagued by a series of attacks on women by a mystery man that was dubbed Dartman. And he was named because he had wounded 22 women with an air gun firing pencil-width metal-tipped darts that were 1 inch long. This happened in the span of 2 weeks. He would strike from 10 p.m. to 2 a.m., and the women lived in ground floor or low-lying apartments. They would be standing near open windows. I bet you haven't heard about this because I had never heard about these attacks, this Dartman stuff. Now, the first one that was attacked was a pregnant woman living in Hartsdale, and she's washing dishes near a kitchen window when a dart cuts through the screen and hits her in the collarbone. The steel dart with a feather drew blood and fell into the sink. Her husband runs outside but can't find anyone in the yard, saying she can't understand why she's been targeted, but made sure in the coming months not to be standing next to windows. Think about that. You're washing your dishes, and all of a sudden, a steel tipped dart, which by the way, it didn't really do any lasting damage, but it could bring out an eye. It could hurt somebody very seriously. Now, based on his actions, a composite was put together by the police as to who the perpetrator was. They said it was a young man, a voyeur, a peeping Tom who probably had a hang up on women, and he had graduating to inflicting pain on women. Psychologically, he was portrayed as inexperienced with women and with a fear or hatred of them. Right? And this is sometimes some of these serial killers, I hate to say, this is how they start. They start as peeping Toms, then they graduate to this, and before you know it, they fantasize about rape and then ultimately killing a woman. Now, the only clue police had was that he might drive a 1971 or 1972 Chevy Monte Carlo. They believed he lived in Yonkers since many of the attacks occurred there, but they admitted he had easy access to parkways, which made it possible for him to be anywhere in the area. Now, think about this, because here they are. They're thinking, well, could be here, but again, like they even theorize some crimes that, let's say, certain businesses that are held up. Sometimes it's because they are close to certain highways. In other words, for the perpetrator to get out of there quick. So at this point, this thing about him living in Yonkers was just a theory, in other words. Now, 19 police departments were assigned to investigate the crimes, which started in February 1976 and seemed to end in July of the same year. Then in December, the police department got egg on its face when they found out about another attack by listening to public radio accounts. This is when they decided to set up a hotline, and the department described the sniper as a phantom. Quote, they said, "We don't even know if he's traveling on foot or by car." End quote. See what I mean? The last victim was a 23-year-old woman living at 17 Beaumont Circle in Yonkers. Lucky for Dartman, the son of Sam stole the attention of the authorities in August of 1977, and police didn't spare much thought as to why he had stopped sniping at women. Like, in other words, nobody thought, I wonder if either Berkowitz or who Berkowitz was hanging out with, one arrest, was what ended the Dartman's career. However, it was inevitable that with David Berkowitz in custody, questions were being asked if he could be the elusive Westchester Dart sniper. The connection was made since Berkowitz had moved to Yonkers in April 1976, and there was an overlap when the attacks were being committed, even though none of the women targeted by Dartman had died. Also, no dart gun was found in Berkowitz's car and apartment when he was arrested. Now, food for thought there. And in one of the slides, you're going to see there's a composite of all from the different witnesses of what supposedly the son of Sam looked like. And you can tell they're all different people. There's one that looks like Berkowitz, but the rest don't look anything like him. Anyway, after 45 years, there's speculation of a connection between Dartman and the son of Sam killings. However, there is only circumstantial evidence to link Berkowitz to the Dartman. He has never admitted to the crimes. There were also questions about the remains of 3 dogs that were dug up from behind 35 Pine Street, where Berkowitz lived. 2 neighbor boys found the dogs in plastic bags in December of 1976 and buried them in a nearby wooded area. After reading of Berkowitz's hatred of dogs, they dug them up. They said 2 of the dogs had chains around their necks and the third had a hole in its head. All were German Shepherds. For some strange reason, when reporters asked police about the finding, they said they didn't know of any dead dogs. and doubted they would be of any use in the case of the 44 caliber killings. See what I mean? Like, they got their man. Let's not stir the waters. That's it. It's over. Detective Wicca, or Wicca, I don't know how to pronounce that, from New York City said they were not interested in the dogs as a possible angle. They're satisfied they got their man, he said. Why the police so easily dismissed the connection between the dogs and Berkowitz is unknown. Laura Pisaturo, the sister of one of the boys who found the dead dogs, described how in May 1977 she had been waiting for her boyfriend a little after midnight when Berkowitz approached her. She said, "He came up to me and just stared. I smiled at him because I was scared. He didn't smile back. I walked away and ducked into the house. My heart fell into my stomach." According to her, Berkowitz had been walking a dog in the parking lot when he came to where she was. He had once worked with guard dogs on the docks and had reported a hatred of dogs. Later, it turned out he shot the dogs of two of his neighbors. In May, there had been no shootings. She had seen Berkowitz occasionally but didn't know who he was until after his arrest. She said, "I wouldn't have recognized him from the drawings, the police composite. It didn't look anything like him." This supports the theory the composites were of different people and not Berkowitz, and that perhaps there was more than one perpetrator involved in the crime. David O'Gorman, who lived across from Berkowitz on Pine Street, believes all of the incidents are connected. Carl Denaro, who survived a Son of Sam attack in October 1976, believes the person who shot him in the head was not Berkowitz. Now, this excerpt is from the Encyclopedia of Unsolved Crimes, written by Michael Newton, and he wrote, "Journalist Maury Terry, investigating alleged satanic connections in the Sams case, discovered that Dartman was a symbol of death in 15th century Europe. It made a tantalizing lead, combined with reports of cult gatherings, canine sacrifice, and ritual gang rapes in Westchester County. But without a suspect or a solid lead, the trail went cold. A similar series of woundings blamed on an unknown blowgun sniper were reported from Washington, D.C. in the spring of 2002. That case also remains unsolved." Interesting, huh? All right. Now, Terry's theory was that Berkowitz might have committed some of the murders, but not all of them. He was chosen as a decoy to take the fall and play the part of the crazy murderer. Terry theorized they'd convince him by assuring him he would probably be sent to a sanitarium and not prison. His in-depth analysis of the timelines of the murders showed where there were some incidents where Berkowitz didn't fit the description, or he could not have been present at the times of the murders. Once he was in prison, it's believed Berkowitz was threatened with harm against his family, and in the years after his arrest, many of his associates were murdered or died in horrendous and strange circumstances. Starting in June 1984, for almost a year, several rapes and murders of teenage girls occurred on Long Island. The evidence pointed to a gang of 3 or more men. One of the cases was solved, but with the evidence that other accomplices were involved in other slayings, Maury Terry found a connection between devil worshippers that were not identified or caught for the murders. The first victim, Kelly Morrissey, 15, vanished on a walk home on June 12, 1984. 5 months later, her friend, Teresa Fusco, was forced into a van after leaving a skating rink. This was only a mile from where Kelly had disappeared. Fusco's body was found 6 months later. She had been beaten, strangled, and raped by at least 3 men. John Kogut, 21, an unemployed dropout, was picked up on burglary and disorderly conduct. When asked about the Fusco murder, he confessed and named 2 accomplices. Kogut's confession was videotaped where he said that Teresa had gotten into a van with him. Restivo and Halstead, who was the father of 5 and owned an aluminum siding business. The 3 of them worked occasionally for a moving company Restivo's family owned. They had driven to a nearby cemetery. He said Restivo and Halstead raped Teresa and persuaded him to strangle her. They dumped her body near Hot Skates. He later recanted, but testimony of several inmates who were jailed with the defendants was used. Morrissey was still missing, but her diary made mention of a date with Kogut. Kelly Morrissey has never been found, but her family believes she is deceased. As of 2023, Kelly Morrissey, again, is still what they call not even a missing person. All right. She's left behind all her money. She left behind all her money, all her belongings. Which, in other words, this because a lot of times these girls that go missing, sometimes they want to say they ran away, that kind of deal. But her family obviously thinks she left her money and her belongings. This was not a plan like I'm leaving, I'm running away kind of deal. Now, Maury Terry visited the scene and found a cult sign linked to Satanists in Queens and Yonkers, who he suspected were part of the group who participated in the Son of Sam case. On Sunday, March 26, 1985, 19-year-old Jacqueline Martorella left her friend's house to walk to Burger King to start work. She never made it to work. A month later, Jacqueline's body was found naked and strangled on the 17th hole of the Woodmere Country Club. Near to where Martorella was found, searchers found an abandoned cellar decorated with cult symbols. Outside was clothing similar to some described by Martorella's parents that she was wearing when they last saw her. Kogut denied participating in the cult and said he killed her because she threatened to go to police. On May 9, 1985, police announced that a gang of 12 men were linked to 3 known murders and at least 4 rapes where the victims survived. Prior to Kogut's trial, a friend testified of Kogut's involvement in Satanism and commercial pornography. His name was Bob Fletcher, 30, and he supposedly committed suicide in Rosedale, Queens on June 2, 1987. Police were unable to find the gun he used to shoot himself. That's unusual, right? Maury Terry, while investigating the Son of Sam, found a reference to Dartman as a 15th century symbol for death. Okay. During his research, he found symbols and occult clues would be left at scenes that were mostly difficult to recognize for what they were, because they were so strange. And police, they're not trained to look for these things or notice them, in other words. In a 1561 painting titled Death and the Miser by Hieronymus Bosch, there's a depiction of a deathbed scene in which death creeps into the room holding a long, thin dart, not the scythe which was more commonly used. There is another painting by an unknown artist titled The Dance of Death, where the skeletal death holds a short, pointy item very similar to the metal-tipped darts that were used. In the early 1990s, 3 sets of DNA tests were conducted, using an unused swab of semen taken from Teresa Fusco's body. 2 excluded all 3 men, but 1 didn't exclude all 3. In 2003, all 3 convicts were released on a $300,000 bond based on DNA evidence that showed semen found on Teresa Fusco belonged to another man. In 2005, further testing found the semen did not belong to any of them. This would leave the case of Teresa Fusco unsolved, along with Martorella's and Morrissey if she ever is found, and a rapist and killer walks free. So, basically, part of what Maury Terry was talking about is he's thinking there's, when you read some of his materials, like there's this loosely based group of, if you want to call them Satanists, psychopaths that call themselves Satanists because they're all on the same page. Who knows? Okay. A lot of times they are involved in pornography, child pornography, dealing drugs, and occasionally this is part of what they do, killing, especially on certain significant dates, killing for the sake of killing. How's that? Because sometimes murders are committed for love, if I can't have you, nobody can. Hatred, I hate your guts, revenge, or even business. In other words, there's a clear-cut reason why people they lose and they commit murder. But this is where murder for the sake of murder for the sake of bloodshed, and in a lot of these cults, especially these dark ones, that is part of the tenets of the group, killing for the sake of killing. And sometimes you even have to look at the dates that these things are committed on. So basically what he was saying is, was there a connection between Dartman and Son of Sam? Not that even David Berkowitz did it, but that who he was involved with. By the way, it's true. A lot of the people that he was with prior to his arrest, died horribly. Suicide, bad car accidents. It's like the odds on that are astronomical, but it happened. Was there a group of these guys running around? And of course, this is like one of those things, once you're in it, you can't get out because they know everything about you and they know where you live and they know where your family lives and that kind of deal. Um, and he's trying to say that even if they weren't, even these men that were set free, that doesn't mean, because they were going on the seamen, that doesn't mean they were not present. All right. Here's like this one guy is going to testify and he commits suicide. Why? That's mighty coincidental. Mighty convenient too. But anyway, let's get on to this second story. 1970 strange story. All right. This one got a resolution kind of not too long ago. So here we go. And at the time that this happened, this was it got a lot of press. But like all these cases, it's very sensational and then they go cold and they fade from the headlines. Now, Arlis Perry, 19, was murdered inside Stanford Memorial Church 2 weeks before Halloween 1974. Her body was posed and mutilated in what appeared to be some type of ritual murder. Decades would pass before the identity of her killer would become known. However, questions still lingered. Now, you're going to see that, besides being murdered inside a church, what they did with her body is very obviously some type of ritualistic killing. Now, again, this is California, 1974, and Arlis grew up in Bismarck, North Dakota, and married her high school sweetheart, Bruce D. Perry. Both of them attended the same high school and were popular students. And there's my background puppy. Arlis was a cheerleader, and Bruce was the son of Dr. Duncan Perry, a dentist, and he played sports. And they both belonged to the Fellowship of Christian Athletes. During his years of freshman in Stanford, Bruce corresponded with his fiancée, and he came back home to tie the knot and return with his bride to continue his studies. They had an apartment at Quinnell Hall, a residence on the campus for married students. 6 weeks after leaving Bismarck, the one thing Arlis missed was her friends. Her husband was busy with his pre-med studies and tutoring other students. This environment was totally different from the hometown in North Dakota, where she noticed people were friendlier. However, she was expanding her horizons when she secured a position as a receptionist at the law firm Spade, Blaze, Valentine, and Cleanett 2 weeks before. Now, it's October 12th, around 11 p.m., and she decides to walk to the mailbox and drop off letters out for Bismarck. Her husband, of course, goes with her, and as they cross by the church, this is about a half mile from their apartment, they start having an argument, which escalates. And she tells him, I'm going to go inside to visit the church. And she would just catch up with him later at the apartment. And what does he do? I guess since he's upset or they're upset, he walks back to the apartment. So this is close to midnight when this has happened, when she goes inside, and that there were two other persons inside praying, all right? And they leave because at midnight, this is when they close the doors of the church. And let's face it, it's midnight, like, hello. Now, the people in there, they leave because they're thinking, okay, they're going to close the doors. And she stays inside. And later, a passerby describes where he sees a man in his 20s who's about to go inside. He has sandy hair, parted on the left, medium build, wearing a blue short sleeve shirt and jeans. Now, the security guard, his name is Steve Crawford. He doesn't get there until 10 minutes past midnight, doesn't see anyone, and he locks up the doors. Now, the hours go by, and Bruce calls the police at 3 a.m. because his wife, Arlis, hasn't come home. He had gone to the church about 12:15 a.m., but the doors are locked. All right, and he checks the side entrance, and those doors are locked as well. So later, Stephen Crawford, the security guard, who, by the way, was a former Stanford police officer, he says that he finds her body just before 6 a.m. on October 13th in the east transept near the altar. He found the west side door forced open from the inside. Her hands were folded across her chest on top of her torn shirt and her jeans had been folded across the legs in a diamond pattern. She was nude from the waist down, and her legs were spread apart. A 30-inch altar candle was shoved into her vagina, and another one was placed between her breasts. Arlis had been strangled and beaten, but what killed her was the ice pick plunged into the back of the head. The handle was missing since it was broken off. The final embellishment in this ritualistic tableau was a large carved cross, which loomed above her. Crawford told police that he checked the doors at 12 a.m. and they were locked, but there was no one to verify if this was true or not. A church official who viewed the scene called it ritualistic and satanic. Later that afternoon, the non-denominational church was reconsecrated by Fathers John Duryea and Robert Giguere, who celebrated a Roman Catholic Mass, which began with a blessing scripted to reclaim the place from the forces of evil. Now, initially, the main suspects, of course, are her husband, Bruce Perry, Steve Crawford, security guard, and an unknown sexual psychopath, possibly the one seen entering the church as it's closing. Now, the police, they hold back on certain elements of the crime from the public and the press, including the fact the FBI in Washington, D.C. lifted a perfect palm print from the candle inside of Arlis' vagina. Later, it would prove not to belong to Crawford. On October 15th, a service is held for Arlis, and in the meantime, police continue the investigation. They interviewed Mark Connors, who worked at the same law office as Arlis, and he related a strange story, which unfortunately the police didn't pursue as closely as they should have. One day before her death, Arlis was at the reception desk when a visitor arrives, and this gentleman, this co-worker, Mark Connors, he's assumed this is her husband. He sees her speaking to this young man for 15 minutes or so in what he described as a serious and intense manner. Even though he thought that she was angry at who he thought was her husband, he was like, I guess he's thinking marital problems, young couple, who knows. And he describes him as a young man, husky and athletic looking, dressed in jeans and a plaid shirt. He's about 5 feet 10 inches tall, has curly blondish hair, and appeared clean cut. However, Mark Connors thinks it's strange that Arlis doesn't introduce him. He realizes the mistake when he sees the real Bruce Perry at the church service, and he realizes that was not her husband. When questioned by police, Bruce Perry denied going to her job and also thought it would be strange that his wife had not mentioned the visit. This was confirmed by her friends in Bismarck, who were also eventually interviewed by police. The most glaring clue that was overlooked was the stranger who visited her job. He was similar in appearance to the young man seen entering the church just before it closed. Who knew Arlis enough to come to her job, since she had only been in the area a little over a month? Is it possible she knew him from somewhere else, even Bismarck? If one thing was certain, was the premeditation aspect of the crime. The killer brought an ice pick with him, which is not usually what one carries to a house of worship. And at the end, I'm going to revisit that whole thing about the ice pick. Now, later the police theorized the stranger who came to the office was a delivery man. But this seemed unusual that she would have a 15-minute conversation with an unknown person. Either she knew him, or he came on behalf of someone she did. Arlis was interred on October 18th at Sunset Memorial Gardens in Bismarck. Most of those who attended the wedding were present for the funeral rites. 2 weeks later, on Halloween, something strange happened. The temporary marker placed on her gravesite was stolen. No other marker in the cemetery was taken. The police found that a couple of trophies were taken from the murder scene. Could the marker have been another one? In the meantime, word reached Bruce Perry's parents in Bismarck. It seemed that Arlis and a friend, who they didn't know the name of, went to Mandan, a neighboring town, to convert members of a satanic cult to Christianity. This happened during the year when Bruce was away in California. Was this story true? The Santa Clara police did a cursory investigation, and it turned out others had heard the story, but no one could provide specifics. Bruce Perry would go on to graduate and become a doctor, and the case became cold and then inactive. Then in 1979, a clue would surface. It was a passage found handwritten across a page in a book about Satanism, which read, quote, Arlis Perry hunted, stalked, and slain, followed to California, Stanford University, end quote. In Maury Terry's book, The Ultimate Evil, he describes where Lieutenant Terry Gardner in Minot, South Dakota, received a book titled The Anatomy of Witchcraft, which reached them via a middle person from David Berkowitz, who had been convicted of the Son of Sam crimes. Among other notes he highlighted in the book, there was a chapter called Evil on the Coast, where he underlined a sentence in a section about the process which read, Thou shalt kill. They say they are dedicated to bringing about the end of the world by murder, violence, and chaos. But they, the chosen, will survive to build a new world of satanic glory. End quote. On the same page with a specifically marked asterisk and in brackets, he indicated a section about the Chingones, which research shows was an offshoot of the Process Church based in California. He referenced other groups in the state tied to the occult. The Process Church of the Final Judgment was founded in 1963 by born Robert Moore, excuse me, and Mary Ann McLean. And they met in England, and they were part of the Church of Scientology. And in the early 60s, they split off from this Church of Scientology, and that's when they established the Process Church of the Final Judgment. And they reinvented themselves and took the surname of de Grimston because they thought it sounded like, I don't know, aristocratic, I guess. They flee from England, and they go to Mexico and the Bahamas. And they finally arrive in the United States via Mexico about 1968. So, according to the church's charter, quote, it was called by God to bring about the end of the earth and the final judgment of man, end quote. They predicted the world would end in 2000 and that Satan and Christ would be united. They also went by the name of the 4 Ps and the Institute of Compulsions Analysis. In 1966, while in Mexico, the couple with 22 followers lived in a roofless salt factory in Ixtul, where most of them were barefoot and dressing in rags. They lived without any utilities and ate beans. The only one reasonably dressed was Marianne de Grimston, who wore bikini and a light suncoat. It was noted most of them came from very affluent backgrounds, one of them being Sabrina Verney, 19, daughter of Sir John Verney. Mary Ann de Grimston was originally charging a large amount of money for an introduction into the group. It was believed the mastermind of the group was Mary Ann de Grimston and not her husband Robert, who she ousted in 1974. And for those of you who are watching the video, you're going to see there's one picture. There's just one picture of Mary Ann de Grimston. And even then, that picture is not the best. This woman took great pain, all right? She's already passed away. Never to have her likeness captured. And you know what? If now that we're talking about the 70s, if anybody remembers, that was her. The opening scenes of the first Godfather film. What's the big deal? That they're upset because there's photographers or news reporters or whatever taking pictures. And none of these guys in the mob want their likeness captured. And this lady, let me tell you something, she did not get, there's one which is believed, one picture, okay, that is believed to have been her. Call it what you will, but usually people that are up to nefarious stuff take those kind of troubles. So, that right there. And by the way, if you go further, it's true. The one that was running that show was her. And of course, you know, what the followers they wanted is, remember, the 70s again, the 60s and the 70s are still part of, you know, when people think of the communes and all that free love and all that crap. And of course, who she brings over to Mexico is not some broke person. These are people, or young people, most of them, of course, are young, from very affluent backgrounds, which, by the way, she charges for the privilege of hanging out with her, you know, and eating beans. Isn't that wonderful? But anyway, let's keep going with the story. So, here they are. They, eventually, like I said, she Marianne kicks Robert, I guess she's done with him, out in 1974. But back in 1972, it's believed that the organization, again, this, remember, this is almost 10 years since they split off from Scientology in England, and now they've come over to the U.S., and even then they're still considered either a cell or a splinter group of the Church of Scientology. Now, the Magical Mystery Museum in L.A. was a front for the group, and it was alleged 6 members of the process acted as the muscle for the Church of Scientology. A source told the FBI the process had its origin in an Arizona state prison. I don't think they meant the process as in the process originally, but maybe where they recruited some of their members from. Now, this was the time period when Arlis Perry is murdered at Stanford University in California. Now, the goal of the process was to set up chapters and coffee houses in major American cities as a way to recruit members. A New York chapter was established in the late 70s, which is when David Berkowitz became a member. And he became associated with the individuals running what would become Best Friends Animal Sanctuary, known as BFAS, which, by the way, still is in existence. These persons were believed to have been involved in several murders that occurred in New York. In 1974, the BFAS changes, I'm sorry, not the BFAS, because they're not in existence at that time. The Process Church, they changed their name to the Foundation Faith of the Millennium, and they relocate to Arizona. Now, by 1978, the process is operating in Boston, Chicago, New Orleans, Miami, Houston, and San Francisco. In 1980, they changed the name once more to the Foundation Faith of God. And in 1993, the Foundation Faith of God changed its corporate name to Best Friends Animal Sanctuary and was organized specifically as an institution devoted to the charitable and religious purpose for the prevention of cruelty to animals. That same year, BFAS purchased 3,000 acres in southern Utah, which was originally named Canab Canyon and was renamed to Angel Canyon by the BFAS. The goal was to take care of abandoned and abused animals. As of 2000, which many years ago, so I imagine there's got to be more money involved, it was written they had solicited and received more than $1 million a year from individuals and corporations. The inner circle of BFAS, by the way, was the same one, originally from England. All right. Now, the 1970s was a decade when there was good reason to worry about cults. The most infamous example was when Jim Jones killed hundreds of his followers in 1978. There was another cult at that time in Guyana that was called the House of Israel, and it was led by a fugitive from the U.S. who called himself Rabbi Edward Emmanuel Washington, or Master, King, or even God. This is what he asked his followers to call him. Now, his real name was David Hill, and when the Jones People Temple poisoned their flock, Washington had thousands of members. He was in Guyana himself. However, in 1986, he was in prison for 15 years after pleading guilty to manslaughter. But the ones that tried him, in other words, he went to a jungle prison, was there in Guyana. I don't know the exact specifics of that, but yeah. Now, Dr. Robert P. Hopkins, an instructor at Harvard Medical School, wrote in 1978 that research showed cult members were generally from Jewish or liberal backgrounds, none typically from Roman Catholics or evangelical Protestant backgrounds. He wrote that according to research done by Dr. Harvey Cox, dean of the Harvard Divinity School, cult members he studied were people, quote, were people who were withdrawn from problems in their own lives and in the world at large. These individuals wanted to retreat into a safer, simpler world provided by the cult environment, end quote. Dr. Margaret T. Singer, a psychiatric professor at the University of California in San Francisco, wrote that cults have trouble recruiting lower-class young people. Lower-class youth in the United States primarily know there are no free dinners and no free meals. They can recognize a street hustle. Middle and upper-class young adults have not had enough experience with street hustlers and growing up to know how artful deceivers on the street can operate. Dr. Singer explained, quote, cults supply their members with ready-made decisions about careers, sex, and marriage, and the meaning of life. In return, they demand total obedience. which they maintained through various programs of coercive persuasion, end quote. She offered group therapy for those fleeing cults, and most of them were tired and undernourished, since they were forced to spend long hours on the street soliciting money for the cult. Dr. Singer testified as a brainwashing expert in the trial of Patty Hearst. She also played a role in the trial of Kenneth Bianchi, the Hillside Strangler, and testified he was faking symptoms of multiple personality disorder. She faced harassment and death threats from groups that feared her exposing how most cults work. She was an outspoken critic of Scientology and traveled under an assumed name to avoid harassment. Dr. Singer's family and students were harassed as well. Her office was broken into, and cult operatives would go through her trash and mail. They also picketed her lectures, hacked her computer, and released live rats in her house, as well as leaving dead animals on her doorstep. Whether cults were suspected in the murder of Arlis Perry is unknown, and despite having occurred on a major university campus, like we said, the case went cold, and the years slipped by. Fast forward to 2016. A new witness comes forward for the Perry case. His name is Brian McCracken. He's 64 years old, and he tells police that an entertainer living in New York is responsible for the crime. And he tells them this story, a very unusual story, of what happened inside Stanford Church on October 12, 1974. He says, he's telling police that he had left on that night a coffee shop, and he's walking past the church. It's close to midnight, and he hears this very strange flute music coming from inside, which is kind of unusual considering what time of night it is. So he goes inside, and this is what he described as to what he saw. Quote, this guy up at the lectern, a young skinny white guy, and he has an afro wig on, a light-colored large afro wig. Looked very striking, and he's playing a flute, a large silver flute. To the right of him on the altar was this nude girl on the altar. She has candlesticks burning one on either side of her. As I walked down the aisle, he looked at me. He doesn't seem happy to see me. And then she's lying flat on the altar, and she is looking straight up to the top of the church. She turns her head to the left and smiles. By this time, I am within 20 feet of the flutist and her on the altar. Now, McCracken tells police that he thinks they're playing some type of black mass game, like later on what we know later on the recently like LARPing. And back in the 1970s, this was not such a far-fetched idea. He says this girl looks comfortable and doesn't appear to be afraid, but the one who's getting the menacing looks is him. So he leaves the church, and he doesn't tell police about this because he doesn't connect the story in the newspapers about the murder of Arlis Perry and what he's witnessed. Let me tell you something. Personally, I don't see how you could overlook that, but this is what he tells police. Now, within the next few hours, you know what, after he witnesses this scene, of course, Arlis Perry is killed, and, Stephen Crawford, the security guard, makes a discovery of the posed corpse, because this is the thing, her corpse was posed, and her panties were found around her right foot, and there's a prayer pillow stained with semen, which is found next to her, right? Now, it wasn't until 1979 that, believe it or not, that the Santa Clara County Sheriff's Department spoke to Berkowitz in Attica Prison for 30 minutes, and he becomes agitated, and he's evading, and because remember, this is around the time that this other sheriff in Minot is getting these books underlined with these passages mentioning Arlis Perry. So he gets agitated, and he's evading answering the questions, and he's asked if he's talked to the person who killed Arlis Perry. And he didn't answer either way. He's like, I don't want to talk about this. So that was the end of that. Nobody digs. And you have to understand, especially back in these years, and this is not stupid of them, whoever these perpetrators were, they understood that when you commit these crimes in different jurisdictions, it's really hard for these different sheriff's department or police departments, or whoever it is, to work together, because not only are they different jurisdictions, they're in a different state. And that just slows investigations even further. Now, in 2011, this is how this came about. This guy, Brian McCracken, he's having this conversation with a cop who's retiring, who's telling him the story of his cold case involving a murder that's been committed in a church. And this is when he thinks, oh, what he saw that night, and then it might be related to this cold case that this policeman's telling him about. And he says that that man that he had seen at the altar playing the flute, he had seen the guy in the Stanford marching band. Which, by the way, makes, that's maybe why he's playing the flute. So, anyway, he goes on the internet and he finds a picture of the guy and it matches the man he saw. I don't know if he went on the internet and found, like, maybe they had pictures of Stanford's marching band or whatever. In other words, he tracks down the guy. So, he gives a report to the Santa Clara County Police. This is in December of 2011. And the detective in charge of the Perry case, along with another officer who had become a private eye, and a female psychologist, they interview the man or the person that he pointed out. They catch up with this person in February of 2012. And this musician said he had thrown away the afro wig, which coincides with what McCracken had seen, and denied visiting the church. Soon after the interview, the musician left California. Okay. Now, is it coincidence? I mean, how would McCracken know that this guy was using an afro wig of all things? That's really unusual. Okay. Or maybe it's very weird. But the fact that he left California, either, when people know something. But anyway, so in Maury Terry's book, The Ultimate Evil, he posits that Arlis Perry's murder, among others, was carried out by a satanic cult that runs pornography, drug sales, and a murder for hire ring. The case eventually went even colder, and it wasn't until DNA tests were done on the semen evidence that a definite link was made to Crawford, the campus security guard. On June 28, 2018, police came to his home in San Jose, California, 20 miles from the university, with a search warrant. He locked the door to his bedroom and he shot himself before the arrest. Later, police found the torn-off cover of the book, The Ultimate Evil, among his belongings. Now, the police also did find a suicide note, but they realized that he had written this note back in 2016 because they had questioned him back in 2016. So he had been contemplating, I'm going to kill myself, even back then. And I guess maybe in 2016, for whatever reason, they didn't keep on questioning him. So that's, in other words, this man had always planned that if the police came back for him, this is how I'm going to handle the situation. Now, what happened? The police, after the crime. This is right after this is after Arlis Perry's murder. They visit his apartment, and they don't find any evidence of occult practices, but it's cluttered with what was suspected to be stolen property. In 1992, he's arrested for taking rare and antique books from Stanford offices, where he had keys for. He even made himself an actual Stanford graduate by falsifying a blank diploma he stole. Coincidentally, he was a drum major and band president at Notre Dame High School in Sherman Oaks, class of 1964. All these weird connections between guys in the bands, in their high school or university band is like, that's weird. But so fast forward, all right. Again, this is the 1970s. There's weird stuff going on, not only in New York and in Yonkers and in Westchester County, but over in California. Now, one important answer that dies with Crawford is whether he killed other people. It had been over 40 years since Arlis was murdered. Did authorities believe that he was a participant but not the actual murderer? His death tied up a lot of loose ends, and perhaps it was thought prudent not to expose if there were others involved in the brutal murder so many years before. But this was not a far-fetched idea, since there was a dark undercurrent rippling through Stanford in those years when the murder of Arlis Perry took place. In May 1970, a 19-year-old co-ed was the third woman to be robbed and raped at gunpoint at the university within a 6-month period. She was leaving her job at the Student Union Coffee House Two victims later identified a man who gave his name as Charles Allen Matthews, 22. It's unknown what became of the charges, but he died in 1986. In 1973, Leslie Perloff's body was found in a clump of bushes on Stanford property. She'd been strangled with her scarf, and her skirt was pulled up around her waist. There was blood on her raincoat, and her pantyhose was stuffed in her mouth. Her case, like Arlis's, went cold, and not until 2018 was there a connection made via DNA. 5 months after Stephen Crawford killed himself in 2018, authorities arrested John Arthur Gertrude, 74, for the murder of Leslie Perloff. A year later, he was tied into the strangling of Janet Ann Taylor, 21, who was killed in March 1974, also at Stanford. Gertrude was married and living in an apartment in Palo Alto when he committed these crimes. Now, in 1963, let's go back a few years, Gertrude, he's 18, and he rapes and strangles a 15-year-old named Margaret L. Williams, who's the daughter of Lieutenant Colonel Robert Williams, who's the chaplain for the U.S. 8th Infantry Division. Gertrude, he's the son of Sergeant Charles Gertrude, who was stationed in Germany. Her body, this young lady, Margaret Williams, her body is found behind an American youth club, nude and savagely beaten. He was convicted and sentenced to 10 years. He served 6 years and then he was paroled. He leaves Germany, moves to Reno, Nevada, and marries his first wife. This is 1970. Now, from 1971 to 1975, he moves to Palo Alto, which is the years that he killed Perloff and Taylor, right? And then in 1975, he pled guilty to statutory rape of a 17-year-old and served only 1 month of a 6-month sentence and paid a $200 fine. Now, in 1978, his wife divorces him and he marries a second wife. A year later, he moves to Newark, Ohio. 10 years later, he's back in California, and now he moves around the state. He's got all these different addresses, and he also uses like different spelling of his last name, either with like a TREW or an REV at the end. And during this time period, his second wife dies. I believe it was from cancer, and he remarries. This is his third marriage. Ironically, from about 2007 to 2008, he served as exalted ruler of the Fremont Elks Lodge 2121 in Fremont, California. Now, it's 2018. Like I said, this is about 6 months after the DNA evidence, put to bed Arlis Perry's murder case. And now this guy, he's tied into his crimes, also with DNA. And it's found that he was a former employee of the Stanford Medical Center. And he had been working as a security guard elsewhere at the time of the murders. He became a suspect in other cold cases. However, he died on September 22nd, 2023. That's less than a year from now, while serving his sentence. On a side note, there was a series of tunnels that ran from Stanford Chapel to Frenchman's Tower on Old Page Mill Road that date back to the 1880s. Could they have been used back in the 1970s? Also, who did the palm print found on the candle which was used to violate Arlis' body belong to? It wasn't Crawford, since he was cleared back in 1974. Why did Arlis Perry insist on going to a mailbox at 11:30 p.m. on a Saturday night when it would not be picked up till Monday? Officially, this case is considered closed, but is it really? Right? And as you can see, sometimes you get answers, but then you get more questions after you get those answers, which is, how did that same thing? Who was that guy that visited Arlis Perry at work? Who was the palm print? I'm sure they could have said, well, it could have been anybody in the church that handled the candle. I don't know, but how many people would do that? That they couldn't have gotten a palm print off of them to compare. All right. And again, the tie-in, I was reading a recent article that they said that because you would think there was premeditation on the part of who killed Arlis Perry. In this case, they're saying it was Crawford. that he came with an ice pick. But in a recent book, they were saying that nearby there was a print shop, and that he took, like, in other words, he took that they would use like an ice pick to clean out some of the machinery. Yeah, I could see that, but let me tell you that that was staged pretty elaborately. This wasn't some guy that killed her and rapes her. This thing of the staging inside a church, there was something there more than meets the eye. And I guess since everybody that could probably know something about it either is dead or won't talk. But yeah, I think there was more to it. Probably more than one participant. Maybe Crawford was involved in it. Maybe he was there. Maybe he didn't kill her himself, but they made him put some semen just to make sure he kept his silence. Like, hey, don't ever throw us under the bus, because guess what? Remember, we've got proof it was you. There's a lot of things that could probably be involved in that, but like I said, most of the time they just want this to be over. So again, I hope you enjoyed these two strange stories from the 70s. And until next time, thank you for spending this time with me. And you are all wonderful. Take care.